Mafia boss was seconds away from arrest until his maid outsmarted the cops with a fake trail. Before we dive into this story, I want to ask you something. Have you ever seen legitimate authority destroy someone who didn't deserve it? Have you watched corrupt officials hide behind badges and legal paperwork while they ruin honest people's lives? Because that's what this story is really about. Not just a dangerous romance, but a question of who the real villains are. Sometimes, the most dangerous criminals wear suits and carry government IDs. They smile in courtrooms while they steal everything you have, all perfectly legal, all wrapped up in permits and regulations. At least people like Alfredo Guerrero are honest about what they are. So here's my question for you before we begin. If you had to choose between corrupt respectability and honest darkness, which would you pick? Drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're watching from. And if you believe the system doesn't always protect the right people, hit that like button and subscribe. Because the stories I tell challenge everything you think you know about right and wrong. Now, let's meet Alana Cooper, who's about to make that exact choice on a rain-soaked night that will change her life forever. The night air hung heavy with moisture as Alana stepped into the dimly lit alley behind the sprawling estate. Her hands gripped the handles of the industrial trash bag, its weight pulling at her shoulders with each step. The brick walls on either side rose like barriers, their surfaces slick with rain, casting jagged shadows under the flickering security lights. She'd been working at the estate for only 2 weeks now, but the wealth still caught her off guard. Even this service alley seemed cleaner than the streets she'd known back in Illinois. The commercial dumpster sat beneath a halogen lamp, its metal surface a stark contrast to the battered bins behind her father's failed construction office. With practiced efficiency, Alana hoisted the bag toward the opening. That's when she heard it. The screech of tires on wet pavement, urgent voices shouting in Spanish and English. A figure materialized from the shadows at the alley's far end, a man moving with controlled speed despite his obvious flight. He was older, perhaps 40, his frame powerful beneath an expensive leather jacket that seemed incongruous for someone fleeing through back alleys. Their eyes locked for a heartbeat. His were obsidian black, calculating, filled with something that made her breath catch. Not panic exactly, but intensity. Something instinctive recognized the predator in him, the way a deer senses the wolf. Yet there was something else in that gaze too, something assessing, measuring, watching to see what she would do. The wail of federal sirens shattered the standoff. They began as distant warnings, but crescendoed with each passing second, bouncing off brick and concrete until they seemed to surround them from all directions. The man's jaw tightened, his body coiling with the tension of someone weighing impossible options. His hand moved toward his jacket, toward a weapon. She realized with cold clarity. Rain began to fall in earnest now, misting the air between them. Alana's heart hammered against her ribs as headlights swept the mouth of the alley. Red and blue lights painted the wet walls, in alternating pulses of color. She could hear car doors slamming, boots hitting pavement, the metallic sound of weapons being drawn. The man pressed himself against the wall, his expensive clothes already darkening with rain. His breathing was controlled, measured, the composure of someone who'd been hunted before. The leather jacket clung to broad shoulders that spoke of violence held in check. His entire being radiated dangerous capability, even in retreat. Federal agents burst into the far end of the alley, their tactical gear sharp against the night. 3 of them, weapons raised, flashlight beams cutting through the rain like searchlights. Alana stood frozen, the trash bag forgotten at her feet, her mind spinning through calculations she didn't understand. "Federal agents!" one called out, his voice sharp with authority and adrenaline. Miss, did you see anyone come through here? Male suspect, dark clothing, armed and extremely dangerous. Alana opened her mouth, then closed it. Her thoughts cascaded over each other. The man's calculating eyes, the federal badges, the weapons, the rain. It was too much, too fast. She thought of her father, destroyed by men with badges and legitimate authority. She thought of official corruption hiding behind official seals. And she thought of this stranger who hadn't begged, hadn't threatened, just waited to see what kind of person she really was. Yes, she stammered, her voice steadier than she felt. Then, without fully understanding why, she pointed toward the opposite end of the alley, away from where the man had melted into the shadows behind a service entrance. Someone ran that way, maybe 2 minutes ago. Male, dark jacket, heading toward the main street fast. The agents exchanged rapid glances, already moving. Which direction on the main street? East, Alana said, the lie flowing more easily now. Toward the commercial district. He was running like he knew where he was going. The lead agent barked orders into his radio as they sprinted past her, their boots splashing through puddles, leaving her alone with the rain and the pounding of her own heart. The flashing lights receded, the sirens faded into the distance, and gradually the alley returned to its rain-soaked quiet. Alana stood there in the mist, trying to process what had just happened. The trash bag lay forgotten at her feet. Her hands trembled as she pushed wet hair from her face. She'd just lied to federal agents. She'd just helped a wanted man escape. A man who might be everything they said he was. Armed, dangerous, criminal. But in that split second, when their eyes had met, something had passed between them. Not a plea for help, but a test. A question asked without words. What will you choose? And she had chosen. Chosen instinct over authority. Chosen to trust her gut about corrupt officials over their badges. Chosen to help a stranger who hadn't asked for help, but had simply given her the choice. As she finally bent to retrieve the trash bag with shaking hands, Alana had no idea that the mysterious man was already watching her from a secure location, surveillance footage replaying her decisive lie. She had no idea that she'd just saved Alfredo Guerrero, one of the most powerful cartel bosses in North America. She had no idea that her impulsive choice in a rain-soaked alley would drag her into a world where every decision carried life or death consequences. The only thing she knew for certain, as she hurried back toward the warmth and safety of the estate, was that she'd crossed a line tonight. And somewhere in the shadows of this city, a dangerous man now knew exactly who she was and what she was capable of. The morning sun filtered through the estate's floor-to-ceiling windows as Alana moved through the grand foyer with her cleaning supplies. 2 weeks had passed since that rain-soaked night in the alley, and she'd almost convinced herself it had been some sort of fever dream. Almost. She ran the microfiber cloth across the mahogany side table, careful not to disturb the fresh orchids arranged in crystal vases that probably cost more than her entire month's salary. "Good morning, Miss Cooper." The voice came from behind her, rich and accented, making her spine straighten instinctively. Alana turned to find Alfredo Guerrero descending the curved staircase, immaculate in a charcoal suit that probably had an Italian name she couldn't pronounce. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly styled, but it was his eyes that caught her, those same dark, calculating eyes from the alley. Recognition flickered between them, unspoken but undeniable. "Good morning, Mr. Guerrero," she managed, offering a polite smile while her pulse kicked up. He paused at the bottom of the stairs, studying her with an intensity that made her feel simultaneously seen and evaluated. "I wanted to thank you for your help the other night." Alana's hands stilled on the cloth, so it had been him. "I don't know what you mean." Of course you don't. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, neither warm nor cold. Still, your discretion was appreciated. He moved past her toward his office, leaving the scent of expensive cologne and unspoken danger in his wake. The days that followed revealed fractures in the facade of normalcy. Alana noticed things she'd been too new, too overwhelmed to see before. The security cameras covered every angle, their lenses tracking movement with professional precision. Men in suits that couldn't quite hide their shoulder holsters came and went at odd hours, speaking rapid Spanish in the hallways. Conversations died when she entered rooms, replaced by careful smiles and polite nods. She learned to read the rhythms of the house. Tuesday mornings meant encrypted phone calls behind closed doors. Thursday evenings brought visitors who arrived in blacked-out SUVs and never gave their names. And always, there was Alfredo, watching her work with a predator's patience, as if trying to solve an equation that didn't quite add up. "You're from Illinois," he said one evening, appearing in the dining room where she was polishing silver. Not a question. Small town outside Chicago. Alana kept her hands busy, unsure why his presence made her heart race in ways that had nothing to do with fear. "You did a background check?" "I do background checks on everyone." He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, utterly at ease in his expensive casual wear. "Your father had a construction company," the cloth stilled in her hands. Had, past tense. Bitterness crept into her voice before she could stop it. City officials decided they wanted the land for a development deal. Suddenly we were drowning in code violations, permit denials, inspector harassment. My father did everything right, followed every rule, and they destroyed him anyway. She looked up, meeting those dark eyes directly. "So, forgive me if I don't always trust people hiding behind badges and official titles." Something shifted in Alfredo's expression, understanding, perhaps, or recognition of a kindred spirit. The most dangerous criminals often wear the most respectable masks. Exactly. The word came out fierce, surprising them both. He moved closer, close enough that she could see the faint scar along his jawline, the silver threads in his hair that spoke of experience rather than age. "Have dinner with me tomorrow night, not as employer and employee, just conversation." Alana knew she should say no. Every instinct of self-preservation screamed that this man was dangerous in ways she couldn't fully comprehend. But she thought of the way he'd looked at her in that alley, not pleading, not demanding, just waiting to see who she really was. "What time?" she heard herself ask. 8 o'clock. I'll have Carlos prepare something special." His smile was genuine this time, transforming his face into something almost tender. "And Miss Cooper? Thank you for seeing people for who they are, not who they pretend to be." As he left, Alana returned to her silver polishing, her hands steady despite the chaos in her chest. She was playing with fire, she knew that. But for the first time since her family's world had collapsed, someone looked at her and saw not a victim, not a servant, but an equal, even if that someone might be one of the most dangerous men she'd ever meet. The gunfire stopped as suddenly as it began, leaving only ringing silence and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Alana's ears buzzed as she pressed against the hallway wall, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. Through the smoke-hazed doorway, she watched Alfredo lower his weapon, his movements controlled and deliberate even as blood, someone else's blood, decorated his once pristine shirt. "Clear!" Carlos's voice echoed from somewhere in the mansion, followed by responding calls from other security personnel Alana had never known existed. Alfredo's eyes found hers across the devastation, and something flickered in their depths. regret, perhaps, or resignation. He holstered his weapon and moved toward her with that same predatory grace she'd noticed in the alley, except now she understood what she was seeing. This wasn't a businessman. This was an apex predator in human form. "You shouldn't have seen this." His voice was rough, accent thicker than usual. "Carlos, get her." "No." Alana pushed off the wall, her legs steadier than they had any right to be. No more orders. No more pretending. She gestured at the chaos around them. Shattered glass, bullet holes in expensive wallpaper. Bodies being dragged away by men in tactical gear. "What is this? What are you?" Alfredo's jaw tightened. For a long moment he just stared at her, as if calculating how much truth she could handle. Then something in him seemed to break, or perhaps surrender. "I run the Guerrero Cartel, territory from Sinaloa to the Midwest. Those men came to take what's mine." He looked toward where the attackers had fallen. "I don't negotiate with threats." The words should have terrified her, should have sent her running for the nearest exit. Instead, Alana heard herself asking, "The news reports, the killings they attribute to you, are they real?" "Most of them." No hesitation, no attempt to soften the truth. "All of them necessary." Necessary. She tested the word, found it bitter on her tongue. "And the innocent people caught in the crossfire?" "There are no innocent people in my world, Alana. Everyone makes choices. Those men chose to attack my home." His eyes burned into hers. "You chose to help a stranger in an alley. That choice put you in my orbit. And now my enemies know your face. You need to leave, tonight, before what?" She stepped closer, surprising them both. "Before I realize that you're more honest than every respectable official who destroyed my father." Anger heated her words, years of bitterness finally finding a target. "Those men wore suits and carried government IDs while they ruined us. They smiled in courtrooms while they stole everything we had, all perfectly legal, all wrapped up in permits and regulations and absolute lies." Alfredo went very still, watching her like she was something dangerous he couldn't quite categorize. "You're a criminal," Alana continued, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "I'm not naive enough to pretend otherwise. You've killed people, hurt people, built an empire on violence." She met his gaze without flinching. "But at least you're honest about what you are. At least you don't hide behind badges and legal briefs while you destroy lives. You don't understand what you're saying." His voice dropped to something almost pleading. "If you stay, there's no safety. My enemies will use you to get to me. They'll hurt you, kill you, just to prove they can. Then teach me not to be a victim." The words came out fierce, final. "I'm done running from powerful men who want to break me. Maybe it's time I learned from one instead." The air between them crackled with electricity and possibility. Alfredo's hand lifted, almost touching her face before he caught himself, fingers hovering inches from her cheek. "You have no idea what you're choosing. The blood, the violence, the constant looking over your shoulder. I'm choosing you." Alana closed the distance between them, her hand covering his suspended one. "Not because you're safe, because you're real." Something cracked in his carefully maintained control. His other hand came up to cup her face, thumb brushing her cheekbone with surprising gentleness. "This is madness." "Probably," she whispered. "Show me anyway." His kiss was inevitable, fierce and claiming, tasting of gunpowder and desperation. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, The mansion around them was silent except for Carlos quietly securing doors in the distance. The world had shifted irrevocably. There was no going back to employer and employee, no pretending at normalcy. "Welcome to the darkness, Alana Cooper," Alfredo murmured against her temple. "God help us both." The shooting range beneath the estate was nothing like Alana had imagined. Industrial lights, soundproofing that swallowed noise, and targets that looked disturbingly human. Carlos stood beside her, arms crossed, watching her fumble with the Glock's weight. "Wider stance," he instructed, his gruff voice echoing off concrete walls. "You're not holding a teacup. This thing kicks." Alana adjusted her feet, remembering Alfredo's hands on her waist 3 nights ago, correcting her position with a touch that lingered longer than necessary. She squeezed the trigger. The recoil jarred her shoulders, but the bullet hit center mass. "Better," Carlos almost smiled. "The boss said you learn fast." The boss. 2 weeks since the attack, and Alana had been pulled into a world that operated by rules she was only beginning to understand. Morning training sessions with Carlos, afternoons sitting silently in meetings where men discussed territory like chess pieces and spoke about violence with clinical detachment. Evenings with Alfredo, where he taught her to read the undercurrents of power, who was loyal, who was afraid, who was planning betrayal. "Again," Carlos ordered. She emptied the magazine, each shot more confident than the last. When she lowered the weapon, Alfredo was leaning against the doorway, watching with an expression that made heat curl low in her stomach. "Carlos, take a break." His voice carried authority that wasn't questioned. They were alone in seconds. Alfredo closed the distance between them, taking the Glock from her hands and setting it aside before pulling her close. His kiss was hungry, demanding, tasting of the expensive tequila he'd been drinking upstairs during negotiations. "You're getting good at this," he murmured against her throat. "Too good. Sometimes I wonder if I'm creating something that will destroy us both." Alana pulled back to meet his eyes. "Having second thoughts about keeping me?" "Every day." His hands tightened on her waist. "Every day I think about putting you on a plane, giving you money, sending you somewhere safe, where my world can't touch you." He pressed his forehead to hers. "And every night I'm selfish enough to keep you anyway." "I'm not going anywhere, Alfredo. I know. That's what terrifies me." He kissed her again, softer this time, almost reverent. "When I was 16, I watched rival cartel members execute my brother in our kitchen. Made me watch to teach me about power, about what happens when you show weakness." His voice roughed with old pain. "I swore I'd never care about anything they could take from me, and then you lied to federal agents for a stranger." "I'm not your weakness," Alana whispered fiercely. "I'm learning to be your strength." Above them, footsteps thundered across flooring. Carlos's voice rang out, sharp with alarm. "Boss, we've got a problem. Diego's gone dark. His phone's off, and Torres says the federal surveillance on the north side just went active again." Alfredo's expression shuddered instantly, the vulnerable man disappearing behind the cartel boss. "How long?" 20 minutes, maybe less." Betrayal. The word came out cold, final. Alfredo turned to Alana. "Stay with Carlos. Don't leave his sight." But Carlos was already moving toward the commotion upstairs, and the next moments blurred into chaos. Men shouting, engines roaring outside, the distinctive pop of gunfire from the east wing. Alana reached for the Glock, Carlos's training overriding panic. Then hands grabbed her from behind. Too many hands, too strong. A cloth pressed over her mouth and nose, chemical sweet and suffocating. She fought, kicked, heard someone grunt in pain, but the darkness was already closing in. The last thing she heard was Alfredo's roar of rage, distant and desperate, as consciousness slipped away. She woke to concrete and zip ties, her wrists bound behind her back in a warehouse that smelled of rust and fear. 3 men watched her with the cold assessment of professionals, and in the corner, playing on a laptop screen, was footage of the estate. Current live, with Alfredo's face twisted in fury as he screamed orders at his men. "Welcome back, Miss Cooper," one of her captors said in accented English. "Let's talk about how much you're worth to Alfredo Guerrero." The warehouse door exploded inward at 3 in the morning. Alana heard it from where she was zip-tied to a metal chair. The boom of breaching charges, followed by gunfire so concentrated it sounded like a war zone. Her captors scrambled for weapons, but they were already too late. Alfredo came through the smoke like vengeance incarnate, Carlos and 6 others flanking him with military precision. He moved with terrifying efficiency, each shot deliberate and lethal. The man who'd questioned her for hours went down first, then the one who'd backhanded her when she refused to talk. The third tried to use her as a shield, pressing a gun to her temple. "Drop it, or I'll..." Alfredo's bullet took him through the eye before he finished the threat. The body crumpled, and suddenly Alfredo was there, cutting her restraints with a knife that had blood on the blade. His hands trembled as he cupped her face, checking for injuries with an expression she'd never seen before. Raw, desperate fear. "I'm okay," she managed through split lips. "Alfredo, I'm..." He kissed her hard enough to bruise, then pulled back to bark orders in rapid Spanish. His men moved with practiced efficiency, clearing the warehouse, securing the perimeter. When he turned back to her, the vulnerable man was gone, replaced by something cold and calculating. "Diego sold you out," he said flatly. "Federal witness protection in exchange for testimony. But he made one mistake. He told his cousin first." Alfredo's smile was terrible to behold. "Carlos has him at the estate, along with someone else who's been playing both sides." The drive back was silent, except for Alfredo's hand gripping hers hard enough to hurt, as if he was afraid she'd disappear if he let go. At the estate, men had gathered in the main hall. The entire organization, it seemed, summoned to witness something. Diego knelt in the center, zip-tied and bloodied. Beside him was Miguel, the accountant Alana had seen around the estate, looking far less composed than usual. Both men had the hollow-eyed look of those who knew exactly what was coming. "Betrayal," Alfredo announced to the assembled room, his voice carrying absolute authority. "The oldest sin in our world. Diego sold information to the federales and rival cartels. Miguel embezzled from our operations while keeping 2 sets of books." He paused, letting the words sink in. "The punishment is clear." Then his eyes found Alana's, standing beside Carlos near the wall. The room held its breath as Alfredo walked to her, taking her hand and leading her to stand before the kneeling men. "You're part of this family now," he said quietly, meant only for her ears but carrying in the silence. "In our world, you don't just accept the protection, you accept the responsibility. What happens to traitors, Alana?" Every eye in the room watched her. This was the test, she realized. The moment that would define whether she could truly stand in Alfredo's world or if she was still playing at understanding darkness. Diego looked up at her, pleading silently. Miguel was crying. She thought of her captivity, the questions, the threats. She thought of Alfredo's face when he'd found her, devastated at what they'd done to her. She thought of the choice she'd made weeks ago in a rain-soaked alley. "In this world," Alana said clearly, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Betrayal has one price. Make it quick. We're not animals." Something flashed in Alfredo's eyes, pride mixed with sorrow. He nodded to Carlos, who raised his weapon with professional detachment. 2 shots, clean and final. The bodies slumped. Later, in Alfredo's private quarters, Alana's hands finally shook as she cleaned the cuts on his knuckles, injuries from the rescue she hadn't noticed before. He watched her in silence, something like wonder in his expression. "I love you," he said suddenly. "I've loved you since you pointed those agents in the wrong direction, since you chose chaos over safety." Alana set aside the first aid supplies and kissed him, tasting blood and desperation and something that felt like coming home. "I love you, too. All of you. The violence, the control, the darkness. I'm not afraid of what you are, Alfredo. I'm afraid of what I'd become without you." "Dangerous," he murmured against her lips. "We're dangerous together." "Good," she whispered back. "Let them all know." The grand hall of the estate had never held so many dangerous men in one place. Regional commanders from across 2 nations filled the space. Cartel lieutenants from Sinaloa, distributors from the Midwest, enforcers from the border territories. All summoned by Alfredo Guerrero for a gathering that happened perhaps once a decade, if that. The air was thick with tension and expensive cologne. Every man armed despite the weapons check at the door. Every conversation weighted with unspoken threats. Alana stood beside Alfredo at the head of the room, wearing a black dress that Carlos had insisted was appropriate for the occasion. Elegant but severe, commanding respect rather than attention. Her Glock rested in a holster beneath the jacket she wore, its weight now as familiar as breathing. 6 weeks since the warehouse. 6 weeks of learning this world from the inside, of becoming something she'd never imagined. "Gentlemen," Alfredo began in Spanish, then switched to English, his hand finding the small of Alana's back. "For 20 years, I've built this organization on one principle, strength through control, but I've learned something." He turned to her, his dark eyes intense. "The strongest empires aren't built by one man alone." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some faces showed skepticism, others calculation. Carlos stood near the wall, watching with the focus of a man ready for violence at a moment's notice. "This woman saved my life before she knew my name," Alfredo continued, his voice carrying absolute authority. "She's proven herself in blood and fire. She's killed for this family, bled for this family." His hand tightened possessively on her waist. "From this moment forward, Alana Cooper stands as my equal partner in all operations." The declaration sent shockwaves through the room. One of the older commanders, Rodriguez from Culiacan, stepped forward. "With respect, Jefe, she's an outsider, American, young. How can she understand?" "She understands loyalty," Alfredo cut him off, his voice dropping to something dangerous. "She understands that corruption hides in boardrooms and courthouses as easily as it does in our world. And she understands that any order she gives carries my full authority." He paused, letting the words settle. "Any threat against her is a threat against me. Anyone who sees her as weakness will learn exactly how wrong they are." Carlos moved first, stepping forward to bow his head toward Alana. "Jefa," he said. "Boss." The word hung in the air for a moment before others followed suit, one by one acknowledging her position with varying degrees of acceptance, some genuine, others pragmatic, but all bowing to the reality that Alfredo Guerrero had just rewritten the rules of his empire. Later, after the last SUV had disappeared down the drive and the estate had returned to its usual controlled chaos, Alana and Alfredo stood on the balcony overlooking the grounds. City lights stretched toward the horizon, toward the Mexican border in the distance, marking the vast territory they now controlled together. "Do you have regrets?" Alfredo asked, his arm around her waist, holding her close against the evening chill. About that night in the alley? About staying? Alana was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. She wasn't the girl who'd taken out trash 8 weeks ago. She'd killed. She'd ordered executions. She'd become part of a criminal empire that would make her a monster in the eyes of law enforcement and society. But she thought of her father, broken by legal corruption. She thought of the honesty in Alfredo's darkness versus the lies wrapped in respectability. "No regrets," she said finally. "I spent my whole life watching the good guys destroy people like my father, while hiding behind badges and procedure. At least here, we're honest about what we are." Alfredo pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. "We're dangerous together." "We're unstoppable together," Alana corrected, turning to face him. In the golden light of dusk, his face held the softness he showed only to her, the vulnerability beneath the violence, the man beneath the monster. "You taught me to be strong. I taught you to be human. That's not weakness, Alfredo. That's evolution." He kissed her then, slow and claiming, tasting of possibility and power. When they broke apart, both of them were smiling, the 40-year-old cartel boss and the 25-year-old woman who'd chosen his empire over innocence. Behind them, the mansion stood as a fortress. Before them, the empire stretched vast and dangerous. But together, they were something new, partners in power, bound by blood, loyalty, and a love that existed not despite the darkness, but because of it. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold. And in that dying light, Alana Cooper and Alfredo Guerrero stood as equals, having found what they both needed by becoming exactly who they were meant to be. I hope you like this story. Please share what's your best part of the story and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.